Let's begin. Round 1. Atmosphere. Like other films from this time period, the 1931 version gets a lot of its strength from the cinematography and the set design. While the sets may seem simple by today's standards, they are still well built and very, very elaborate, especially for their time. I mean, compared to how cheap most Hollywood sets have been getting nowadays, I mean, even having sets close to what was in the 1931 Dracula is still considered ambitious by today's standards. Speaking of ambitious, the same could also be said of the cinematography. While there are a lot of lockdown shots and a lot of basic shots, there are also a lot of camera moves as well, which were also pretty ambitious when you really think about it. Because, like many people say, when sound was introduced, it really limited where the camera could go because they had to take into account where the microphone was. But in the case of this film, despite having a lot of the lockdown shots, there are also a great deal of camera moves and a lot of very eerie shots that help create this nice eerie tone. In the case of the 1992 version, a lot of the same things can still be applied, although the sets are a lot more elaborate and a lot more intricate in their design, and, well, Coppola takes full advantage of the fact that, well, we have color. Just look at the costumes, they're really well elaborately designed. There's also color tones applied to the different settings. You get like a grim, dark, black color for Transylvania, you have like a shade of gray for London, and then you kind of have the colors that pretty much set each of the characters apart from the background and from each other. Everything in this film is shot in a style that's reminiscent of a lot of the classic versions of Dracula. It's just Coppola manages to put his own emphasis on it. As such, he achieves his own sense of eeriness by that design. So in the case of atmosphere, it's a bit of a tricky one, but I'm gonna have to give it to the 1992 version. Their overall atmosphere and overall aesthetic is a little more complete, because the 1931 version was plagued by a lot of budget cuts, as well as having to cut out a lot of stuff from the original script in order to fit into the budget. So, in the case of atmosphere, this round goes to the 92 version. Round 2. Story. In the case of the 1931 version, things are kept fairly simple and are given the stage play treatment. As such, there are a few pacing issues. Some bits feel slow, other ones feel a bit rushed, and then there's just some unexplained transitions that are put in to keep the film moving. The cast of characters is greatly reduced from the amount that are in the original novel, and as such, the dynamic has also changed since they've had to cut out a whole bunch of characters, change a whole bunch of characters, and, well, take out a whole bunch of the character traits. The focus has essentially shifted from, well, all the people involved to essentially Van Helsing, Renfield, and Dracula. And that's pretty much it. All in all, it feels like a Cliff Notes version of the story, or the story as seen through the eyes of someone who hasn't really read the book, and only really read the back of the book and the last few pages in order to get the bits and pieces and hopefully understand it. In the case of the 1992 version, the story is a lot more complex, as there's just a lot more that goes on in general. On top of that, the full cast of characters that were in the novel are also in this movie, and are given a great deal of development. Instead of just being like essentially cardboard cutouts of their former selves, the characters are fully developed and are given, well, unique traits that actually set them apart from one another, instead of just being the usual guy, girl, damsel in distress, victim. Basically, the characters are actually given personalities and traits that really let you identify with them and really get you more invested into the story. So in the case of story, this round is going to the 1992 version. Round 3. Faithfulness to source material. When it comes to faithfulness to source material, well, there's a great deal of deviations to be found in the 1931 versions. The character of Quincy Morris and Arthur Holmwood are omitted, and Renfield essentially is swapped out for Harker in the opening scenes when it comes to bringing the Count to London. And, well, a lot of the other deviations are mostly character-based when it comes to this film. Of course, some of the major deviations are also in the case of the film's climax. Whereas in the film's climax, it's essentially Van Helsing killing Dracula in the undercross of Carfax Abbey, whereas in the novel, the climax is where the full party of Harker, Seward, Mina, Holmwood, Quincy, and Van Helsing all slay Dracula back in Transylvania, essentially after chasing him throughout Europe. So, yeah, that's another major change when it comes to how faithful this film is to the source material. The answer, not very. In the case of the 1992 version, my good friend Smitty put it this way: it's the truest to the novel, but it also makes the biggest departure. What do I mean by the biggest departure? Well, it can be summarized with this: Mina and Dracula hooking up. That's the best way to summarize the biggest departure in the film. It's my least favorite part of this film as well, because it's really annoying, but otherwise all the other parts of the story are, well, faithful to the novel. All the characters are there with all their personalities, and all the events that happen in the movie overall also happened in the novel, the Mina Dracula romance notwithstanding. But overall, this film is just a lot more faithful to the novel. So in the case of faithfulness to source material, it's really no contest. The 1992 version also wins that round. Now for the final verdict. Now, let me begin by saying that the 1931 film is a classic. I mean, you hear about it when you're a fan of monster movies, when you're going into film, if you're a fan of vampires or any of those stuff. It's just one of those films that comes up that has essentially stayed a pop cultural phenomenon for many years after it was first released. So that's not really what this is about. The 1931 version is a classic, but the 1992 version of Dracula is the more complete film. It has a more complete atmospheric experience, it tells a better story, has clearly defined characters on top of that, and it's also the most faithful to the novel despite the huge departure that, well, annoys some people, myself included. So, I'm sorry Lugosi fans, but Coppola wins this fight. The winner of this round, well, not this round, this whole battle, is the 1992 version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. I still highly recommend the 1931 version, especially if you're like me and really want to study the evolution of certain things throughout history, like how the vampire has been portrayed in many fictitious stories, not just on film, but how he's perceived by the public consciousness in general. And it just has a lot of technical milestones. However, in the case of the 1931 versions, I actually kind of recommend the Spanish version over the Lugosi version because it does some more creative things with the shots, and, well, let's be honest, Mina shows a little more skin in that one. I'm not ashamed to say that. And that brings this battle to a close. Next week, since it's, well, Halloween, we'll be taking a look at two versions of Halloween. See you then.